Welcome back, listener. This is Aaron Richmond, and you are listening to Aaron's Opinion, the podcast for blind people where we talk about critical issues in the blindness community. Hey, by the way, before we go on, let me just remind everybody at home that tonight's episode of Aaron's Opinion is copywritten by Aaron Richmond and Aaron's Opinion. Thank you. Aaron's Opinion can be heard almost anywhere you get a podcast, from Apple to Spotify to Spreaker, you name it, we're probably there. We're also on YouTube. Give us a follow there. And you can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and you might even want to consider being a Patreon. Hey, you know what? Let me just tell you that tonight's episode, apart from all of those things that you might want to consider, you might want to consider thinking to yourself that listener discretion is advised for this episode. A very, very spooky one tonight, as it fits right into the Halloween spirit. We're joined this evening somewhere from the universe by Ken Delbridge, the creator of Splice Studios and Be Spooked podcast. For those of you who are blind in the audience, you will love to know that Be Spooked is a podcast where they tell, well, pretty much terrifying horror stories using a lot of sounds and excellent narration skills. Ken, welcome to Aaron's Opinion. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, how did you get into this whole spook business?
Well, my background is originally music. I studied in Los Angeles back in the late 80s at the Dick Grove School of Music, based out of Van Nuys in Los Angeles. And from there, I went on and got a job in a jingle company, making sort of little poppy jingles with sing-along melodies that catching your ear. And from that, MTV came to Asia and based themselves out of Hong Kong, where I was. And they basically opened up the whole world of audio editing, audio mixing, and sound design, because they were, at the time, in the early 90s, very much a cutting-edge force in terms of creativity with sound. They loved doing anything and everything and pushing limits. So from there, I ended up kind of popping across the world, because at that time, being able to operate some of these rather onerous workstations, nothing like what you've got now, which is, for example, like Audacity and even GarageBand, which is free and comes with your PC and runs great. Back then, you needed something the size of a cupboard to just handle a mere 8 tracks. That was considered cutting edge, and it was quite an ugly interface to operate, but I was quite good at it. And I ended up doing stuff for MTV. I got a job for a while in Italy, working for a Saudi broadcaster. And I ended up back in Singapore, so sort of south of Hong Kong by about 3 hours by plane, where MTV again had set up shop, having moved out of Hong Kong for tax reasons, and down to Singapore. They got the gang back together again. So I went from Italy back to Singapore. And from there, it's been a pretty good straight path. In 2004, I set up my own shop, Splice Studios. It's initially just a one-man band. Now I work with a bunch of people, often just across the world, because it's so easy to work across the world by connecting with people. And the one thing which is always given prominence, or sometimes lacks prominence in a lot of mainstream products, is audio. MTV loved having great audio. A lot of other people just wanted audio that works. So I did a lot of documentaries for Discovery Channel, National Geographic, that sort of stuff. The storytelling was purely in text and in words. It wasn't necessarily with sound effects. It wasn't necessarily with music. Those were always underplayed. And horror has always been one of those genres where great music, great sound effects really tells the story. And without it, it can fall so flat. So because of just the way you adapt to business, I was doing a lot of stuff for TV, for advertising. And about 2 years ago, we sort of pivoted across to podcasting, because that was what clients wanted to do. And a lot of those podcasts that I did for corporations and for brands, they were quite dry. It was mostly the interview format, much like what we're doing right now. The option to have a little bit of fun and to really sort of stretch your creativity became obvious when, just in looking around at what people were doing, you could have a podcast which was fiction. Now, for me, it presented a couple of problems. I'm not a writer, so I needed to get help in the writing department. So I've been able to tap into a number of friends who quietly want to have their stories come out, which is great, because I tell them, hey, no limits. We can do whatever you want. You want profanity in there? That's okay. It may not be everyone's cup of tea, but if you think it's valid for your story, let's go with that. And then I will take care of the rest of it. From the work that I do, working with a lot of voiceovers and narrators, I have a good pool of voices. So if you listen to the episodes, you'll hear some English accents, you'll hear some American accents, which I think is more universally accepted because of the way American pop culture is so popular across the world. And what it's allowed me to do, because it is a self-funded in-house thing, is we keep it short. We keep it really, really short. If we keep it at 2 minutes, all the better, as long as we hit all those sort of points of being able to tell a good story with a twist and also to be kind of scary. So we've kind of settled in on the format that we like, which is at this point 4 minutes thereabouts, plus or minus a minute, and to be as spooky as possible and to have as good sound as we can, to have as good sound as we can as possible.
Excellent. Everything you've said is really fascinating to me. I certainly hope that this episode will not be dry. I hope that you will find I certainly hope that you will find this episode very interesting, even though I am interviewing you. But yes, that is excellent. Well, I will tell you what really gets it for me is that I just love hearing people who are able to speak English really well. You speak really well, by the way. You're a great speaker. The way you speak, you should narrate more often. I would love to hear your voice on some narrations. But for me, it's about, as the listener to the podcast, it's about, okay, is it well written enough? So the content, is it voiced well enough? And then the sounds that kind of make it artistic and attractive, and then the spook factor at the end. That's really what it is for me. So I'm concerned about how well written it is for me. Let's go back to something interesting you said. You said that in the past you've done some interesting documentaries for various networks. All right. What was your most unusual experience that you had while working on one of these documentary projects? A really shocking experience, spooky experience, a really strange experience that you never thought you'd have doing that project?
Well, most of the documentaries, we do have an unseen narrator. Sometimes it can be a man, it can be a woman, it can be someone with a deep voice, it can be a light voice. Occasionally we get a celebrity narrator. It's not common. But we actually did a 2-hour, and it was split into 2 parts, a 2-hour documentary about Asian horror as a genre. And it explored the differences in how horror is perceived by a Western audience and how it's perceived by an Asian audience. And we got I think his name was Anthony Head. He's an actor who was in the Buffy the Vampire Slayer TV series. He played, I guess, the professor, the older gentleman, and he was our narrator. And it was fascinating hearing someone who you're familiar with as an actor portraying his character. And then all of a sudden we were connected. We were in Singapore. He was in a studio in London, and we were connected via ISDN, which is sort of leased lines. It's a technical thing, which just basically means we get really good audio, but it costs a bit of money per minute. But he was a fantastic narrator. And just doing that documentary was eye-opening, because you realize that for a lot of American horror genre, and this would have been, I guess, when would this have been? Like 2005. Back then, American horrors had become really stuck in a rut. The sort of slasher movie concept was so obvious. You would get your cast, and almost immediately you would know who was going to survive to the end. And it was typically the pretty girl. Right? It was such a cliche.
Sure, right.
All right, and then you knew, here comes the slasher, and he's always like, whatever, he's deranged, and he is going to kill people one by one. And it was so predictable. And then there was a film which came out, I think it was called The Ring. It was remade by an American studio in English with, I think, the actress Naomi Watts. But the original one, it was just, it was, people watched the videotape, and then you had to give it to someone else within 7 days. Otherwise, you would die. And the thing which came on was, right? Remember the ghost? It was creepy in a different way, which was so unfamiliar compared to the American style that they couldn't really understand. It was a hit, and it was made and it was a hit in English. And it sort of demonstrated how all of a sudden you don't have to be stuck with that sort of cliches. You can go completely sort of rogue and go off the ranch and just do whatever you want, and you can still bring plenty of spooks if you're willing to commit to just thinking a little bit out of the box. And for me, that suddenly thought, like, gosh, you think of American cinema as being, and American entertainment in general as being cutting edge. It has the biggest budgets. You can go to Hollywood regardless of what nationality. If you've got the talent, someone will make the various visa requirements happen, and you can bring your vision to Hollywood. They'll put a huge marketing budget behind it, and you get to see your vision on screen. And obviously, it has to have commercial returns for the studio. But there are some, you look across the line of various famous directors, and many of them aren't Americans. They've just ended up there because of economic reasons. And then you end up, unfortunately, because people are quite safe when it comes to risking big chunks of money for films, they end up doing the same thing. So the Asian audiences, which some of these movies, if you look at the original ones in the native language, you look at it and think, wow, that's actually quite badly lit. It's the sound isn't great, but the idea is so innovative, it's so fresh, and it allowed for a lot of different spooks, which now I think has improved American cinema a lot. Cabin in the Woods, which was a movie by the same director who did some of the Avenger movies, he completely twisted the genre topsy-turvy. And that was, I think, the point when people started realizing, okay, American horror's got its mojo back, and now it's much better. And those documentaries, they just want music as a pad. They don't really want huge sound effects. They want to concentrate on the voice. But doing that documentary on Asian horror showed me that, you know what? There's so much of storytelling is done not in words, it's done in music. If you want to portray someone as being I think the phrase is, I can't remember, the untrustable narrator, you put spooky music on them. So even though the words that are coming out may seem logical, the fact that you've put that sort of sound very subtly in the background of sort of dissonant chords and tension with violins, you suddenly told the audience, listen to this person, but there's something not quite right. And that subtlety is I guess it's a goal. It's kind of like the holy grail of like being able to lead people across this tension from the beginning of your story until the reveal, because it keeps your audience thinking, what's wrong with this person? I know there's something here. And it's almost fun when you watch these movies with people, and especially if you're a bit chatty with friends, and maybe perhaps you're watching from home, and they'll tell you, I think they're the killer. And then you realize, oh, the director's done a really good job. The sound designer's done a really good job through very subtle things to plant that seed into someone's mind that there's something wrong with this particular character. What's going to happen? And that, in essence, is a spook, because now you're aware.
Exactly. And for me, a lot of, as someone who watches all of the horror content on YouTube, I mean, I watch all the channels on YouTube that deal with horror. Mm-hmm. So if you wonder, Aaron, do you watch that channel? Yeah, probably. Or I've seen it without necessarily realizing it. For me, it is the sound effects. It is the music. I mean, that's really, and the other thing about adding the music too, is that can also make it, like, in addition to being really spooky, as you say, it can also be really soothing too. There's also this element of, how do I even phrase it? Kind of medicinal at the same time, kind of relaxing, kind of ebbing at the same time, I guess is the word. Very, very relaxing and very smooth at the same time. And that's really what, is very, very attractive, I think, to me, as it directly relates to the horror content. Has in all of your experience in directing or working with directors or working in this field, you mentioned the music. Has any director intentionally used music to mislead the audience on purpose? In other words, and can you give a really good example? Maybe I'm 29 years old, so an example that I would relate to.
I think any time where, for example, Sixth Sense, I'm sure you're familiar with that one.
I may not be. So I don't watch much horror movies. I only follow the horror content here or on YouTube. So I'm just into the YouTube style of it. Yeah, and the movies for me, are just, you're very right. They're just, as you said, they're just too cliche and just too visual. And it's